Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing all right. A little bit under the weather, but in good spirits. It's like windy and cold here, which I think I remember spring on the East Coast being. And you guys just got snow, right?
We just got like 8 inches of snow,
Yeah.
and now most of it's gone, and we're supposed to be heading towards the high 70s. So
Oh, good, good.
I'm working with that,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
so yeah, little by little, we get into the sign of the arousing. God comes forth in the sign of the arousing, which
Uh
is
huh.
spring.
Uh
The,
huh.
the buds are opening, and I do have some knock on wood, some apricots setting on the trees
Awesome.
from that little before the snow came. And so now the question is squirrels and other critters.
Yeah.
So,
Well, if there's enough for me to take a few and make some jam, I'd be happy to share it.
yeah, yeah.
So so I saw a headline today about Colossal, which is the startup that has promised to de-extinct the woolly mammoth. And apparently yesterday or this morning they announced the birth of three dire wolves, and I believe two are 6 months old and one is a puppy, which I think means is it
They
possible they cloned them as 6-month-olds, or
No, I
did they
think they
hold on
cloned
to
him
the
off of a
6
gray
months
wolf. Yeah,
and just announce it?
yeah.
Um, and so, ethics has been a theme for us, and a lot of the kind of news coverage I see on this, well, not a lot. The mainstream news is just kind of reporting it, but the commentary on it is this is Jurassic Park, and
Of course,
um,
Jurassic
and
Park.
and we're opening Pandora's box. And so maybe practically and ethically, I think this brings up some interesting questions, and I was curious to kick it around.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's obviously going to trigger today's rock and roll reference
Really? Okay.
from the backwoods of Fenario, right? This is, of course, the song by the Grateful Dead called Dire Wolf. And Fenario is a sort of a mystical place between fantasy and reality. And so it's not inappropriate that the dire wolf should come out of this place that's a mixture of fantasy and reality. A swampy place it is. That's the fen of Fenario. And I guess the Ario is a facility or so. This is the idea of in the backwoods that the direwolf comes out of.
Huh.
So by all means, please don't murder me.
I guess we were on the same page today.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, well, and honestly, puppies has been a theme
Uh-huh.
lately in my world. I mean, who doesn't love puppies? We're calling them now I believe it's pronounced Gauniaki in Polish. Means basically shitlings. And they've, because I maybe it's the post parvo thing, a couple of them will tend towards diarrhea. And that's the kind of thing that, diarrhea in a dog is bad. When you start multiplying it in other dogs, then you're into a scenario there. And so now that it's getting warm, we got a backyard fenced in for them. They're learning about the backyard. So I think things are looking up. The warm weather and they're also getting bigger. Like that's where the real question is: where does it end? The biggest is probably at 51 pounds. I think we measured yesterday, and they're they're fully 5 months old. So this could go on a while. So, but I might be ready for a woolly mammoth after I get these guys grown up. I've
Yeah,
been thinking
there
about
might
getting
be
pulled
another.
around in a wagon, and a woolly mammoth would be pretty good for that.
Yeah, might be another level of dung management, but yeah. Um, what do you think this means ethically? What do you like? What is creating life look like? And we can throw like lab grown meat and genetically modified plants and all that stuff in there too, I reckon.
Well, I guess I push it back to metaphysical assumptions. philosophically, I always like to push it into the what are we actually doing realm, right? That American pragmatic drive. And what we're doing is based on these metaphysical assumptions. And by metaphysical assumptions, I mean questions like, what is it to be a human? What is it to fulfill yourself as a human? What is the point of human life? All of these things that sort of translate down and contextualize the question of what should I do? Right. So because our exciting future of interviews and guests that are coming, and in an interesting way, the episodes that we've had leading up to here and the modern philosophical traditions all sort of end us up in this conversation around ethics. And so I've been trying to go back and been reviewing the different approaches to ethics. And we've mentioned some of them before in the show. I think we've talked about utilitarianism some, and we might have talked about deontology, this idea of having a duty. Going all the way back, we haven't talked, I mean, we have talked about Confucius, but we haven't talked about Aristotle. And really, Aristotle might be the first to really write about ethics, at least the first to write in a way that has sort of set a foundation for Western thought about ethics. And in the typical Greek way, it relies on some concepts that don't directly translate into the English language. And one of those is that's a kind of a central concept to the idea of ethics for Aristotle, is this idea of eudaimonia. And eudaimonia is in his eyes the fulfillment of what it is to have a good life, a fulfilled life as a human. And so in his ethics is really an addressing that question. And eudaimonia, if we take that into the language workshop and we break that down, U, which we see as the letter EU, shows up in the most common word is probably eulogy, where it gets hooked with that LOG, that logos root again. And so a eulogy is usually, we say it's not good to speak ill of the dead. So for the dead, we specifically try to speak well of them. And so we deliver a eulogy, which is a good word. So that you is the same you, which means good. And a word that also shows up in a bunch of curious ways in the Greek, the second half is daimonia. Those of us or those who listen to our episode on La Maravilla del Mundo might recognize from the Spanish, daimonia and daimonios in Spanish. It translates as demon or as a spirit. Demon kind of has a twist on it, right? But this daimonia. So flash to Socrates, and Socrates was famous for being found standing in a place, lost in thought, and would just stand there for hours. And then people later, they would ask him what's going on. And he said, well, I was in conversation with my daimon. And in that case, it starts to take on elements almost of my genius, the voice that whispers in my ear like the muses, right? And so anyway, this eudaimonia literally is good spirit, right? But it has this translation of the life that is a fulfilled life as a human being. So Aristotle had this idea that's an interesting idea that the Chinese, I think, also share some version of. And for Aristotle, he uses the word entelechy. And we might have mentioned this before. And entelechy is this idea that I think gets often described as the oak tree that's hidden inside the acorn. So that when we look at that acorn, if we don't see and understand that it results in an oak tree, somehow we don't get what it is to be an acorn, because that oak tree in potentia is bundled up somehow inside that acorn. It's a mystery, right? Well, that's an example of this entelechy idea, that these that things and people, they all have within themselves an implanted uh, uh, dimension of fruiting out, let's call it, a place that they're heading that is the fulfillment. Now, that's a metaphysical assumption. And I think this is not new to the show, because I introduced that way back in the beginning with the idea of, I think I described it as when the universe viewed you, it had a particular idea in mind. Well, once you were already viewed and spat out into the universe, that doesn't mean that you had yet fulfilled what the universe was thinking. That's why we go through chapters and transitions, just like other life forms do, just like the oak tree does. We've got the sapling, we've got the young tree, we've got the fully grown tree, and then all the way on to the ancient, becomes an icon of its own, the oak tree, right? So with Aristotle, this idea is that to have this eudaimonia, to have a good life, to really be a human in the best capacity, is to be what it is to be a human to the fullest degree. And in his world, this was something that we strive for. It's not just like a state of mind that we carry around and then do all the basic animal stuff. This is about trying to move towards this place. And how do we do that, right? Well, he goes through an elaborate process that's very, step by step. And it starts out with this idea that we do a lot of things. Okay. In fact, we started out with this, really looking at, what do we do? What are we going to do? Well, it turns out we do all kinds of stuff. And Aristotle divides those doings up into two categories of things. First category is things that we do for the purpose of something else. So I make car payments not because I'm fulfilled to send money off in the mail, but I do it so that I can get a car. But it isn't just in having the car. I mean, maybe if you're Jay Leno, but for most of us, it isn't about just having the car. It doesn't end there. We have the car so that we can go to work, so that we can go to the places we want to go. Well, we don't just want to go to work. Why do we go to work? We go to work so that we can get money. And nobody wants money just for money, maybe, but the idea is money is the exact example of something that we do or get for the purpose of other things, right? So that's a whole category of things that we do for other things. But Aristotle says there's got to be something that we do, and that's it. Something that we do that is the fulfillment of the doing, that isn't just a lead on to another thing, because we would be in an infinite regress if we did that, right? So there has to be something that we do it all for. And that thing, whatever it is, that thing has to be the good and the chief good. He comes basically to the idea that virtue or ethical behavior, we do it because it's going to bring us closer to his idea of virtue, which I love. Gets described as doing the right thing at the right time, in the right way, in the right place, to the right degree, to and for and regarding the right people. And that becomes the thing that we aim for. With the idea that as we develop, and we develop, according to Aristotle, through taking on moral exemplars. We look at people who manifest this higher eudaimonia, that fulfill what it is to be a human. until we kind of get in the hang of that ourselves, right? But it's a growth process, a striving that we're always striving to fulfill. Now, this should start by now to sound familiar to the Chunsa, which was Confucius's superior man.
With right thinking and right action and
And that he's rooted in propriety. But the real difference is for Aristotle, it's this individual fulfillment of our entelechy. For Confucius, it looks the same, but the emphasis, the leaning is towards society and towards relationships. So it's like one is one part of the holon and the other addresses the other part of the holon, but the dude in the middle looks the same. He's the superior man. He's the chunsu. He's the guy that knows how to do the right thing at the right time in the right way to the
and I
right
just want to
degree.
clarify for listeners that haven't listened to every episode along the way, when you're referring to holon, you're talking about something that is both an independent entity and a part of a greater entity as a virtue of being networked. So a human being is a human being in and of itself, but in relationship to society, it is a part. So it is both a whole and a part, and that's what a holon means.
Right. And a part of nature and a part of the cosmos. And so what we have in creation is a bunch of nested part holes and whole parts that co-compose and manifest things. So for Aristotle, there's this idea that if you have this idea, and you know, he starts to talk about what are the things that we want to pursue to get us to this eudaimonia. And he loves to, like other philosophers, give you the wrong answers first and explain to you why the wrong answers are wrong, and so that only what's left is left. So he goes through the obvious things that people pursue when they're doing things. And in the question of what is the final thing that we might be trying to do that is the thing in itself that we're after and not just the thing along the way to some other thing. And so one, of course, question or answer to that, which people come up with is, well, dude, pleasure, duh. And Aristotle says, well, the problem with pleasure is that it's not uniquely human. It's like it's like something that's very animal composed. And so it's not manifesting what it is to be a human and distinctly human entelechy because it's not unique to humans.
I mean, one could argue that that human pleasure is unique to humans. That there are ways that
Yeah.
humans pursue pleasure that are unique.
Yeah, perhaps I don't remember that his argument to that in there, but I'm sure he produced it in a very Aristotelian way, you know. And of course, the next thing that he goes on to, I don't remember the order exactly, uh, is influence and reputation and fame and honor and all that stuff. And he says, well, that can't be it because all of those things depend on other people to provide for us. And so other people can take them away. And so that thing doesn't become a thing that's self-sufficient unto itself. It's a thing that's, somehow vicarious. It's not dependent on us because it's actually dependent on other people. So it's not really our manifesting, any kind of virtue or right action. It's all dependent on others. So that can't be it. And then he addresses wealth. His argument against wealth is pretty obvious that, like we talked about money, it's all there for other purposes. It's all there to be used for some other end. So it can't be an end in itself because it's a means to something else, even if that means it's prestige or something else. And then he says, well, it could be just the possession of virtue. He says, but just the possession of virtue, like courage really only shows up as something that the environment needs to call upon me. Like, so I might have these virtues, but might never exercise them. So that's kind of happenstance. So that can't be it. So what can be it? There's only one answer, and that is the active practicing of virtue, not just the possession of it, but the active manifesting of virtue, which is this uniquely human capacity to be able to do the right thing at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he says, if you're operating like that, then anything you come across, any kind of trolley situation, whatever, you will just know because you're rooted in this. And you may, some of us who heard our previous episodes, they might kind of recognize this idea of the capacity to do the right thing in the right moment, in the right way, to the right degree, and in the right setting with the right people, as the Greek concept, also from Aristotle, called phronesis. We mentioned that was in the Paul Fenn episode we've spoken about a couple times. And that's this literally this practical knowledge to know what to do in the moment. Hot potatoes coming at you. What do you do? That's very different than theoretical knowledge or theoretical wisdom, Sophia, right? This is phronesis. And he says you can't read and get phronesis. You can't, there's nothing theoretical about phronesis. You have to live life and get experience and build that and work with people that have phronesis and have that capacity downloaded to you. And, I can't argue with that. Like that actually fits my experience. And this guy was, way back when, it's going to be work to improve on his argument. But the interesting thing about this, while it is a metaphysics, it's not a theology. He never says to us, do the right thing because Zeus will reward you in the future. He says, do the right thing because it gets you to the humanist. It uses the highest and the best capacities of what it is to be you. And therefore it's going to unfold this entelechy. You're gonna fruit out faster and fuller and richer and all that, right?
This might be a sidetrack and maybe a rabbit hole. So up to you how much time we spend in here. But I'm curious, maybe what you think Aristotle would have thought, and what you think about the degree of individual answer to that. So, so if each of us is engaged in trying to do the right thing at the right time in the right way, etc., the implication might be that there's one answer to that. And by being in the moment and having experience, you'll know what that right answer is when the time comes and you'll do it, which is really not a statement about individuals at all. And on the other hand, I guess I have this mental model that each of us brings our own self, our own authenticity, our own genius, if you will, to that moment where the right thing needs to be done. And how individual is that?
Yeah. Well, and I suppose there's a lot of different metaphors, and people have approached that a lot of different ways. It seems like it implies that there's only one right way. But if we go back to the golf metaphor, so you're on a par three where the green is pretty close. So it's a hole that is technically possible to hit a hole on one without having to drive the ball farther than a human can drive the ball. And so technically, according to physics and given the wind on that day and how much moisture there is in the grass, there's a very small window of correct solutions to get you that hole in one. And the window's so small that when people manage to hit it, they know this is like borderline miraculous. It's that small. Like, and a lot of people go their whole lifetime, they never hit a hole in one. So whatever you do hit though, whether you hit it in 3 or you get a really good first close shot and you can single par in, you might, what is that, a birdie? I don't remember all the wildlife associations, but
I think one under par is an eagle and two under par is a birdie.
oh, okay, so that would be an eagle, I guess, And, so, so what this your score really does tell you a lot about you, and you have an ideal of what you want, which is a hole in one, and you might never hit a hole in one, and it's not like you're gonna go, "Oh, my life was a failure because I never hit a hole in one," but every time you go to that hole, you're trying to hit the damn hole in one, right? So in some sense, it is that kind of like the coast of Norway, nobody ever gets there, but what we're measuring is our ability to measure. And so here we're kind of like measuring our ability to hit the mark, where the mark is the chunsu, or the mark is eudaimonia, or for Kant, the mark is the fulfillment of my duty, I guess. Until we get to the materialists, there is always sort of a metaphysics that's kind of backing it. And
I mean, clearly the pursuit is individual. I just, being a romantic, I tend to want to believe that there's this individual expression, that there are an infinite number of ways to hit a hole in one, not this narrow window. And that if everybody perfects themselves, they all will hit a hole in one in different ways. That
well,
it's just a mental model.
everybody is a different lie, right? And
Yeah.
I mean lie in the sense of where the golf ball is
On the rough
lying
or on the green.
before
Yeah.
you whack it. Infinite places of where the ball can be, and so infinite places of where your foot can be nailed down. So
But it
there's
sounds like
infinitely unique solutions.
virtue itself, maybe is not so individual.
Well, and that's where it depends on who you ask. Because remember Nietzsche, he's kind of at the way other end of the spectrum from Aristotle because he wants you to go out in the desert and he wants you to kill the dragon on whose every scale is written thou shalt or thou shalt not. And so he almost says whatever is the right thing to do, don't do that
You're right.
because you're a new philosopher and you're beyond good and evil, right? But in that case, really, he's just saying, here's a new definition of what's right. And, or, you can even stretch that to Crowley do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, right? And now you start to see that what's all packed up in there is the idea of the law, the idea of regulation of relationship, the idea of you having a higher self that has a true will and that true will is in accordance with entelechy with your unfolding to who you're going to be and that's what you follow and
And there's
that's
an
unique in each
implication there
case.
that the outcome of the entelechy, like the oak tree, is not only an expression of itself and of the potential of the acorn, but fits in
Exactly.
and is the other part of the holon in some way.
And
And
that's
and
where
so
ethics shows up, doesn't it?
yeah.
It's in the part fitting in with the whole. And that's why the chunsu or the Aristotelian good man has a certain manages relationships with others in a certain way. Even for Kant, he says you don't use people as a means, basically, I mean, mashing a lot of Kantian language down into the basic gist. So, a lot of things fall into that category. You don't lie to somebody just to get what you want. You don't, you sort of have to deal with people in a certain type of authenticity. Then we get into the later folks that we spoke about and with Dr. Hauer about each person being an infinity and each person being a face of God. And now that relationship takes on a metaphysical connotation because you're somehow defined by that relationship. Martin Buber, I and thou, right? So yeah, there's a lot going on there. And it's interesting because I mean, I guess you look at the long history on this planet. Does it not make sense that we should end up at ethics about the time that we're connected globally through this media and other things? Shouldn't ethics really start to come to the forefront instead of just efficiency or value creation or like doesn't relationship management kind of show up as a thread that tentacles into all the upheavals that we see that are keeping us from manifesting the what Chris Langan would say, what manifesting us doing it all correctly, doing it all right, which is this idea that if I'm fulfilling my entelechy, which was put in me by the prime mover, Aristotle's cause of the universe, the first thing that moved, right? Whatever put in that entelechy to manifest. Well, if we're all doing that, now we are generating kind of a field of manifestation of what was inside meant to be flowering out. So, there's that becomes a mythic event, right? That could be the so-called millennia. That could be the eschaton. That could be there's different religious traditions that make different references that might or might not be interpreted metaphorically of a kind of okay, there's a rock and roll reference in here somewhere, and I think it's called Childhood's End, and it's maybe reference to the book, the science fiction book of that same idea, where like a generation of children get to where finally they're smart enough that they're close enough to fulfilling their entelechy that the natural harmonization potential of relationship gets fulfilled. How's that for a circuitous way to try to say, you know,
Is that
the
Piers Anthony?
fulfillment of potential of the human race?
Who wrote Childhood's End? Was that Piers Anthony?
I wanna say Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I think you're right. So, somebody might believe that their entelechy is to commit acts of barbarism or what have you, or clone extinct animals and release them in a nature preserve. How might that be evaluated?
Well, if you're going to evaluate it, I think, from a materialist reductionist viewpoint, then it almost comes down to if you can, you should.
Or you could take a utilitarian view on it and say, if it's somehow better for more people than not, or if the
Right,
net benefit is positive, then you should.
right. And so in this case, more belly rubs, win-win. Puppies are good.
Okay.
I mean, that's a pretty straight calculus, right? Which is how the utilitarians kinda put it, or what they would call the utilitarians are really in a class they call consequentialists, which is a silly way for an ethics because you kinda gotta know the ethics before you actually have to make the choice. And we know that when we're on that cutting edge between the past and the future, we're entering not even a probabilistic universe, but just what's just possible becomes relevant, taken into the formula, right?
The possibilistic universe might
The
be a new phrase.
possibilistic, yeah,
Yeah.
universe. And so the idea that we could know the consequences unless we're in only dealing with easy case scenarios, there's a great argument to be made that we need to have some principle that we can carry in with us, and then all the rules-based stuff comes in, or we have the development and the fulfillment of an inboard human capacity, what we called maybe an a priori ethical impulse. This idea when we talked about the prisoner being interrogated and the guy not lying to the prisoner, uh, and there's a question of whether he knew what he was gonna do until he was faced with it. Will you shoot the guy or will you not, right? And, the Meno by Plato is relevant here because in the Meno, one of the characters, Plato's asking, "What is virtue?" And one of the characters in the crowd says, "Well, that's pretty simple, to do good to your friends and evil to your enemies." And, of course, in perfect Socratic fashion, he steers him away from that position with this idea that there is something that is the good and that we have to reach beyond those tribal prejudices, which we've spoken of before. But then again, why? because we want to use reason, because we want to unfold these highest capacities if we believe that the highest capacity is reason. And that's what John Mills thinks he's doing when he's getting utilitarianism. He says, well, let's use math. Like science is so great, let's just science everything. And that's why it gets called a methodology that metastasized into a metaphysics. Right? It's great for natural sciences. Perfect for natural sciences. Humanities, history, aesthetics, not so much.
Yeah.
Maybe metaphysics, not so much.
So belly rubs are great. I'm into them.
Big fan myself.
And there's like a web of unknown consequences that vary in probability.
Yep.
The wolves get loose and disrupt ecosystems. The
Yep.
wolves are sad and lonely. The wolves,
Well, first of all, we know things never escape ever.
but then there's this like more fundamental question, which kind of goes to you can't just evaluate the ethics based on the consequences. You need an ethics to make the decision in the first place. And what should and shouldn't human beings create? I think is challenging to define. Like sort of like a
Right.
what gives us the right.
Well, there's different arguments. One is the power, also known as might is right. God gave us the capacity to tame the West, so therefore manifest destiny. So, an example of that same kind of thinking. We should because we can. Why do we climb Mount Everest? Because it's there. And also the unspoken part, because we can. So that's sort of the and the argument is actually deeper than that. There is this argument that I think Schumacher talks about it, maybe from the other side, which I think it gets described as maybe appropriateness or maybe that's not right, but the idea is that we are created with by nature with the appropriate equipment to accurately interpret and understand nature, which is very teleological because it implies that nature wants to do this. But at the same time, nature made acorns and nature made squirrels, and squirrels like acorns, and that can't just be, again, was this Hunyuan Chi? Was this the cosmic form that lays out the organization of matter? We might know how a cell works, but we can't really make them. The parts we can do, the holism parts, we don't really know where that comes from. The organization. In other words, the part that the left brain can take apart, we have down. The part that the right brain needs to address, so far we pretty much just can write poetry about it
And do
or
this,
operas,
whatever this is.
whatever this is exactly. Yeah, we're all just waiting for Godot to figure it out, right? But so yeah, I mean, there's a question there because I guess I do believe that. And that's why it'll be fun to talk with some of these people that have really worked in this field and thought deeply on it, is that I think it is involved or tied up with identity. That was my initial impulse when I started thinking about this. Because what you do is a manifestation of who you are. And then I realized that I was probably just backing my way into the Chunse, the eudaimoniac perspective, which I still haven't been disavowed of. I mean, I've read a lot of arguments, a lot of materialist reductionist arguments, and they haven't talked me out of a certain entelechy dynamic that I think is manifest. That's why we plant corn, so corn will grow, right? So, yeah, I mean, so I suppose the question is for me, if we're going to move in that direction, shouldn't we really be doing it in a holistic way, which is not just running ramshackle at every different thing we possibly think we could do, but haven't we had enough signals that we need to understand more holistically And I do think that there is a scientific way to go about that, but it's probably not the way that natural sciences are being done now per se. And that there is a way of understanding wholes, but we may need to develop our ability and our as well as our desire to try to understand those things. Holology, would that be called? Is that a thing?
Not yet. Yeah. So I'm just going to keep
Uh-huh.
hacking away here. I think it takes a certain hubris to create life that's in a different category from the hubris that might be involved in climbing Everest. Even though that takes some hubris and
Sure.
as judged by the number of people that don't make it.
Especially if you have a Sherpa carry your butt up there.
Well, that's a different category. That's
But
pride
hubris,
maybe more
uh,
than
yeah,
arrogance. But
yeah,
yeah. So I guess I have an ethic around kind of treading lightly, and the genetically modified plants thing, it's sort of easy to look in the rearview mirror at that as a utilitarian problem, meaning that in concept it's perfectly fine, but the problem is that evil companies use genetically modified plants to do evil things.
or just negligent things even.
Yeah, or negligent companies did negligent things. Evil is an arbitrary word there,
Yep, yep,
just not virtuous.
right.
Uh, but I think where I'm coming from maybe is that life is a infinitely complex system, and when we mess with it, we create unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
And maybe I just have a negative connotation with that. And of course, if we're
It's a
gonna plant
law.
corn or have children or whatever, we're already interfering,
Yep,
I imposing our will on the complexity of life.
right.
But I feel like there are boundaries. And I'm wondering, like, is there any guideline about how we draw those?
Yeah, bioethics in this case. Well, there's a couple ways of thinking about it. What leapt to mind for me was one of the reasons because I came out onto the mesa, which it was. I can't say it was untouched. It had been timbered. They carried a lot of the wood down into the hole in the ground of mine, and had been grazed. So you'd had a lot of the tasty stuff taken off without anybody caring for stewardship about the thing. So it was a land in recovery, but at the same time I became aware of a web of life that works across the mesa. And over the years, I become more aware of it. And we're talking about different varieties of wildflowers, different varieties. I mean, badgers and bobcats, and and because I built my own house. I was in, I was inadvertently answering the question, although it was pragmatically answered for me also in ways. The question, how much nature do you wanna let in here now? Just how much do you wanna share with nature? And, I was just remarking the other day how I thought it was a good sign that I was seeing spider webs hanging from the ceiling as I was knocking them down with the broom, because that tells me that the environment is healthy for the creatures that the spiders eat. And I consider them tiny, tiny, tiny canaries in the coal mine, if you will. So I was actually heartened to see spider webs growing here and there, right? And I was kind of laughing about how an inverse sort of a value system that might be. But you look at some of the health numbers, and I think there's an argument to be made for it at least. But so, I had the question, how many trees do I cut down? How many roads do I build? How much, I know people that want to take out all the cactuses because they're pointy to me, or now, I there have been areas where we took out all the goat heads. But, goat heads are a special category. They're evil, right? But but in general, there is the question, how much of a rip do I wanna make in the fabric here just to stick myself in? And for me, it isn't just a moral question of try not to destroy stuff, although that's obviously a component. It's also the idea like, if you wanna hear something that's very subtle, you can't make a lot of noise. Like, it's easy for you to make more noise than will enable you to hear anything, right? Like the impact you have reduces the dimensions of your potential experience of the situation. So what that says to me is you want to creep in there like a ninja so that you don't scare away everything, Like when the bobcat walks by the window and while I'm washing dishes, that tells me that I haven't denatured everything so bad that the bobcat's like, I don't know what's going on there, but I'm not going around there. So there is this idea that I'm going to understand the fabric better, the the smaller the hole I tear in the fabric. And so for me, a part of it is curiosity, right? A part of it is me wanting to understand the entelechy of all these other things around me that are coming to fulfillment, even in their role of struggling back from impact from cattle and impact from logging and other nonsense. So there's something to be learned there, and I don't wanna be inadvertently in a case of, blah, 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 where I can't hear it because I'm just so rowdy and I've just destroyed all the clues. Gotta be more Sherlock Holmesian about things. So you don't wanna go tromping all over the crime scene. There's too many clues to pull things, to inform you, and that's why, again, my one-string banjo thing is about nature. That there's we the way we weave in is significant, and we want nature to be naturing us as much as possible. And this is not a conceptual thing, this is a biophysical thing. So anyway, uh do we understand and do we live in a niche well enough to understand how to? Because I'm sure the argument is say, well, we tore a hole in the fabric when we took out the dire wolves just because they kept eating our children. Like, how? psh, Now, maybe it was this cataclysm that took out a lot of things 13,000 years ago. I don't know the story, but I'm sure there's an argument that says we're establishing the web that was broken, and that's why, and that's, of course, I'm sure what the argument for Jurassic Park was also. I mean, who doesn't wanna see a big dinosaur alive? So I understand it. We all had our favorite dinosaur, right?
Sure.
And a woolly mammoth sounds kinda cuddly, you know?
Yeah, I mean a
Yeah,
miniature one.
yeah, but when we get to the short-faced bears, you may wanna think twice.
The cave bears.
Yeah, the short-faced ones, the dwarfed grizzly bears.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a line, and
Well, and
it's
there's a
dictated by
reason
our
that
personal safety.
there's a reason we mastered fire, I think. It might not just be for making tacos and stuff. It could have been because it was
Warfare.
the one ace in the hole.
Yep.
And then there's that whole idea of getting hunted by Neanderthals, but that's a sidetrack.
We should bring them back. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, what could go wrong?
Yeah. There's a Philip K. Dick book, about that.
Planet of
There's
the Apes
a
is where we end
portal
up.
opens to a planet where a different hominid other than Homo sapiens won. It's a parallel Earth, and
Okay.
they have very rudimentary technology. And, the invaders, but who created this portal quickly realized they do not wanna open the potential future of intermingling these hominid species.
Didn't Stephen Hawking's come to a similar conclusion? That you may
Uh,
not wanna be so noisy because we don't know what's swimming around out there exactly.
oh, yeah, yeah.
You only have to see a few episodes of The Borg uh, the next generation to see what a problem that could be.
So so you haven't said this is like this dire wolf creation is ethically one way or another. You've kind of offered some frameworks that touch on it, but not even address it that directly. And I'm curious. I guess I'm inclined to say we shouldn't mess with this, but I can't tell you why, other than my complexity argument, which is admittedly not that strong.
Yeah. Well, and I suppose there's a lot to learn here still, and maybe that's going to be their argument. I don't know that I have. There's other moral atrocities that leap to mind that would get a stronger emotional reaction out of me. Now, I mean, I don't know how much is the belly rub factor, to be honest, because
I
I
mean,
did see
you're not
puppies.
actually going to get a belly rub on a dire wolf. That would be a domestication, right? And that's not a wolf anymore.
Well, I don't know what their agenda is. It can't be to reintroduce it into the wild because its environment was gone 13,000 years ago.
Yeah, well, they can't be pets.
So I suppose the question exists, is it
It's a
really a
it's a
dire
wild
wolf?
animal.
Is it really a dire wolf, or is it a gray wolf that has the genes for a coat like a dire wolf?
Well, and it's supposed to grow as big as also.
They cloned parts onto a gray wolf
Yeah.
genetics. And I think that we're
And
still
what does
kind of
that mean for
harboring the
the
illusion.
entelechy? What does that mean for the entelechy of that particular gray wolf that just got cloned DNA stuff glommed onto it?
Right. Well, and I think though that we have to remember that DNA isn't what they tell us it is. That DNA doesn't contain. Maybe it was Ian McGilchrist was talking about this. Doesn't contain nearly enough information to do what it is purported to do, like to be the real map. So the question is, okay, you've made some DNA modifications of a gray wolf. What do you really have here? As a scientific question, which is, I suppose, sits very close to the question, what are you doing here? Like, are you trying to make a new species of domestic dog that you can say, oh, it is per dire wolf? You know, are you trying to advance science in a way? I can't think that there's an environment that needs dire wolves, except possibly Washington, D.C., but that's another conversation. So, yeah, the question is really, do we need woolly mammoths? Is there a point to repeating a past chapter as opposed to understanding a future chapter? I mean, I guess these are all sort of swim around together. Um, but so I guess I'd wanna see how much of a direwolf these things really are. And is it a direwolf if it didn't come from the direwolf environment? If the environment didn't direwolf it, then it might just be having some mechanisms taken from a dire wolf that are gonna get impacted in other unique ways that are gonna make this a one-off whatever they are.
Well, that's a whole another line. There might be a whole nother conversation at some point about, are we sure the environment didn't dire wolf it since human beings are part of the environment? Um,
Well,
and
that's true.
and that's always an argument that folds in on itself in a funny way.
Yeah, right.
I always think about that when it comes to the insanity defense. Like, we have such a precise definition of insanity, but in many cases, you had to be crazy to do that shit you did. Like, you were clearly insane, and you still are, to be on trial for this crazy shit. You
Right,
must be crazy. What is crazy if not capable of doing this shit?
right,
So,
yeah, and the definition is like, did you know it was wrong when you were doing it?
yeah, eh,
It's kinda loose.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. No, what we really
Certainly,
want is a
that's
scientific.
not a definition that will solve the postmodern era.
No, we want a scientific machine that we can hook up and the needle either goes to evil or good. And then, as long as the machine was calibrated right and nobody broke the seal, we know that we've got 100% accuracy. Well, that's that fantasy, that's that materialist reductionist fantasy.
Yeah.
And that when we deal with humans, it doesn't work that well, turns out. Go figure. And but so when you work with only certain natural sciences, I should say, does it work well? And I think that where it starts to fog up is biology, and that we're still learning a lot. It's not it's not a surprise if major things change in our vision as we move forward here. So yeah, I mean, they did make that sheep. They did clone that sheep. Dolly, was it? And that was kind of a question. And then they realized that if you clone a 4-year-old sheep, you get a 4-year-old sheep. You don't get a baby, same kind of that sheep, because you've sort of copied the copy, or you're going to get what you got. But so it's a question what they're learning, and it's a question of we don't really, and again, are we being honest about evolution? Have we answered the question, is evolution billiard balls, or is there some emergence that's happening there? And I think that there's a lot of levels that we can get smarter that can all kind of dovetail together. So maybe it will come out as a domestic dog when it grows up because of the setting, because the mind level of it that manifested its form just used the direwolf thing to do what it was going to do anyway. What's his name? I think it was McGilchrist was saying, people think that genes are all dominant, but they take a fruit fly and they remove the gene that makes eyeballs. And then they cross it with another fruit fly that also doesn't have eyeballs. There's no genes for eyeballs involved anymore. And those blind eyeballless flies start reproducing. And they reproduce eyeballless flies for about 14 generations. And then what happens? Eyes. Well, where did those eyes come from?
I guess the
Is this
argument is
entelechy
a random mutation reintroduced the gene into their DNA.
in 14 generations? That's pretty good for
Impressive.
random.
Yeah.
And I don't know how often this has been reproduced. I don't know how well they keep eyeball flies out of their eyeballless flies on the
Right.
weekends.
Right.
I mean, so there's always these questions, but that does put a big question. Is something else using DNA? And then we get into what's the difference between a final cause and a proximate cause. Like, yes, the genes made the tentacles, but the the final cause was to create a Cthulhu, right? Or whatever, so that there's some process there. This is what in philosophy they would call teleology. Telos in Greek means a goal or an end. And so the idea that things are unfolding towards a goal is different than saying we're just throwing this down and we're going to see how it comes out, and whatever seems to work, we're going to use that, and then we're going to throw it down again and we're going to see what seems to work, and we're going to just keep working that way. That's the bottom up theory. The telos says that this goal is up here in mind or in logos, right? And that it's somehow shining through and manifesting the wholeness of all those mechanical parts, and that somehow it's in that mystery of the coherence, right? And that's why I'm so interested in the idea that we have an a priori intuition for coherence, because that's that hermeneutical process, right? When we refer the part back to the whole, it's like we do this in an automatic feedback loop that just kind of updates, because we're putting everything through a coherence filter somehow, which is why we can have experiences that have a dramatic impact on our whole semantic model, because we have to go through that coherence building process. So that's why you might sit there with a dumb look on your face for a few minutes while you grok what's going on, which, and that idea of grokking, another science fiction reference, Robert Heinlein this time, Stranger in a Strange Land, to getting to understanding something deeply. with this idea that you're getting it to its entelechy. You're seeing the oak tree and the acorns, and you're kind of getting how it fits in. You're seeing the forest in the oak tree, and you're seeing the globe in the forest, and you see, like that. So, and the idea again with Aristotle is only humans can do this. That's why you should do it. That's why your fulfillment comes by doing it, because this is what it is to be a human, to use your reason and to use all those other capacities to come to a higher and higher sense of the rightness of everything, you
Hmm.
know? And that's one of the interesting things I saw. Just happened to see a guy who was a very credible military pilot who was talking about when things went wrong landing and he saw that he was going to die and he had this transcendent moment. And what he said was one of the things that he saw was how perfect everything was, you know, and which is that idea of the big coherence.
Yeah.
Right? That big Hunyuan chi that sews everything together, and it's all an orchestrated clockwork of nature.
A pretty common experience with psychedelics for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because of that, maybe it stimulates that other, that's the other interesting thing that Ian McGilchrist said was that a big function of the corpus callosum, which is that bridge between the right and the left hemisphere, we think, well, it's a bridge. Why a bridge? Well, a bridge is so things can go back and forth. But what he points out is that a large part of its function is inhibitory, and that is it's a toll bridge. And only certain things get across at certain times based on functional parameters. And so that it's as if the brain has a function of saying, wait, let me handle this from one brain side or another brain side. And so the idea that we can think about things in different ways is very real. That's why, part of why we have this strange system. And of course, McGilchrist and others make the argument that, and Carl Jung talks about The Secret of the Golden Flower. I read that when I was like 16 or 17. And he talks in there about how he refers to the psychic balance of the modern Westerner being different than the psychic formation of the ancient Taoist Chinese who wrote The Secret of the Golden Flower. He also talks about how this text came to him at a very critical point, a very pertinent chapter in his life that crystallized a whole bunch of other things for him. But in that foreword or commentary, he talks about that difference. And I didn't get that when I read it. I was kind of oh, that I'm sure it's still useful, and don't tell me that I can't get anything out of it just because I'm a modern Western person. That phenomenological instinct. I can bracket it. I can use epoche, right, to move back in time and space and culture. That's that hermeneutical process to somehow get something out of this text that's relevant to me. But anyway, this was all preamble to say that we use our brains in certain ways, and we haven't always used it the way we're using it now. And there is potentially a way to misuse it through imbalance. And that's connected to why I'm always saying you have to be in nature, because nature needs to do things to you. That doesn't have anything to do with your conceptual brain. It needs to you need to be in the environment and run the brain circuits that run when you're in a natural environment and you don't know what's going to jump out from behind a bush. You need to connect with all of those things and sensibilities and ways that nature communicates. That's a wake upable thing. And, that's why also with Kung Fu training, I think that waking your body up to move in perfect, response, to do the right thing at the right time, in the right way, to the right degree, right? That should sound familiar, right? That's exactly where I want to be in fighting. I want to do just the right thing. And I want to hone with both halves my ability to do that. And so being body oriented and motion oriented is kind of part of that formula. And so that's part of my formula for how to fulfill what it is to be a human in a way that only humans can be. That's from that Aristotelian idea.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And
Cool.
so Aristotle's book is called Nicomachean Ethics. And that's where most of the stuff I was talking about today comes from. And it was written to his son, Nicomachus. I think we mentioned this in the story in the episode with Dr. Hauer,
Yeah.
and I actually went back and checked that, and it does seem to be that was in fact his son.
Yeah.
So,
Cool. Well, and we exposed some threads that we'll probably come back to. So okay, jury's out on the dire wolves, and we'll see. I think what the intention of this company reveals itself to be, and we'll
right,
reevaluate.
right. And the setting of the industry, the context within which the company is doing this all in with the industry and what's the general thrust and all that. I don't think we'll understand it unless we know that.
Yep.
The swamp in which it lives, its scenario.
Bueno, thank you, Brian.
Sounds good, sir.
Take care.
Have a good one.